10 years ago, when I was just 15, some of the best nights of my youth unfolded during sleepovers with my closest friends. I preferred their houses. My own home felt unwelcoming at times, and frankly, I was a bit embarrassed by it. On this particular Saturday, excitement bubbled inside me as I packed my overnight bag to stay at my friend Mason's place. Mason's family was well off, owning a sprawling house that seemed straight out of a magazine. It was the kind of place where each room whispered tales of comfort and luxury. His parents were warm and inviting, making me feel like part of the family whenever I was there. Their basement was our sanctuary, a well-equipped man cave with a massive 65-inch TV, a pool table, a foosball table, and even a luxurious hot tub. These weekends were the highlights of my childhood, filled with endless games and laughter. Mason and I had bonded over countless nights spent here, and our friendship had only grown stronger over the years. That evening started like any other. Mason and I were lost in our usual antics, playing video games and joking around in the basement, when his dad appeared with unexpected news. His parents needed to leave urgently due to a family emergency and wouldn't be back until around 4 in the morning. We were used to staying up late, especially on weekends, so the prospect of having the house to ourselves was thrilling. Once Mason's parents had left, a wave of exhilarating freedom washed over us. We raced upstairs, raided the kitchen for snacks, and then dove back into our gaming marathon. After a while, though, we switched gears and decided to watch some movies. Mason threw on a horror film, and as the eerie scenes unfolded on the screen, a familiar anxiety began to creep into my chest. I often felt a pang of homesickness when staying at friends' houses, a twinge of discomfort that I kept to myself, embarrassed by the vulnerability it revealed. But that night, the feeling intensified, a heavy dread settling in my heart. I tried to shake it off, thinking I was just being overly anxious. Just as I was dozing off, a chilling sound snapped me back to alertness, the slow, ominous creak of a door. Peering over the back of the couch, my heart thudded violently against my ribs. The door to the laundry room was wide open, its dark maw gaping like the entrance to another world. Despite hoping it was just my imagination, the fear felt all too real. "Mason, wake up," I whispered urgently, shaking him slightly. He murmured in his sleep, barely stirring. Frustration mixed with fear as I shook him harder. When he finally awoke, I explained what had happened. He brushed it off, assuring me it was nothing unusual, and urged me to go back to sleep. But the sight of that open door had unnerved me too deeply. Together, we got up and shut the door firmly, trying to laugh off the creepiness. Mason fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake, my mind racing. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and I drifted off. But the peace was short-lived. I awoke abruptly to a far more terrifying sight. A man, a stranger, stood over us, his eyes hollow, his presence menacing. I screamed, the sound tearing through the silence of the night, and Mason jolted awake. The man's gaze, disconnected and eerie, sent shivers down my spine. In a split-second decision, Mason and I scrambled to escape, darting in opposite directions. I bolted for the sliding door leading to the garden, while Mason headed upstairs. The man followed Mason, and as I burst outside, my heart pounding, I dialed 911. I relayed the address and reported the break-in before ending the call, my thoughts consumed with Mason's safety. I crept back inside, the silence now suffocating, and made my way cautiously towards the stairs. Every step creaked under my weight, betraying my position. Just then, a scream, Mason's scream, pierced the night. It was filled with terror, a desperate plea for help that I will never forget. Racing upstairs, I found the scene that would haunt me forever. The man had Mason by the neck, his intent deadly clear. Gripped by sheer panic, I acted on instinct. My eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on one of Mason's sports trophies. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I grabbed it and, without a second thought, struck the intruder on the back of his head. The man crumpled to the ground, releasing Mason from his grasp. Mason and I didn't pause to breathe. We bolted from the house, our feet barely touching the ground as we sprinted towards the safety of the backyard treehouse, Mason's childhood sanctuary built by his dad. Clambering up the ladder, we pulled ourselves into the wooden haven and huddled together, our breaths ragged and hearts racing. The wait for the police to arrive felt like an eternity. From our perch, we watched as red and blue lights finally sliced through the darkness of the night. Officers swarmed the house, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. After what felt like hours, an officer approached the treehouse. His voice, calm and reassuring, beckoned us down. We descended, our bodies still trembling, and recounted the night's harrowing events. We described the man as best as we could, an older man in his 50s, with unkempt gray hair and an average build, his eyes haunted and distant. The police searched the house and the surrounding area, but found no trace of him. He had vanished into the night, leaving behind a trail of terror. The aftermath of that night was a blur of statements, concerned parents, and sleepless nights. Mason's parents upgraded their home security, and the sense of safety we once took for granted was shaken. The incident became a shadow that lingered in the back of our minds, a reminder of the fragility of our peace. Mason and I processed the trauma together, often talking late into the night about the events. Our friendship, forged through shared experiences both joyful and terrifying, grew even stronger. We became more than friends. We were brothers, bound by an unspoken oath of mutual protection and support. As the years passed, the memory of that night never fully faded. It resurfaced in quiet moments, in the creak of a door, or the flicker of shadows at night. Despite the lingering fear, it also taught us about resilience, about the strength found in camaraderie and the courage to face the unknown. Now, 10 years later, as I narrate this story, the details are as vivid as if it happened yesterday. The fear, the adrenaline, and the relief, it's all etched in my memory. Mason and I often revisit that night, not with fear, but with a sense of gratitude for the life we still get to live and the bond that nothing could break. Though the man was never found, and the shadows he cast are long gone, the impact of that night remains. It's a stark reminder of our vulnerability and the strength we possess when faced with unimaginable fear. But more importantly, it is a testament to the enduring power of friendship and the unyielding spirit of survival that defines us. Mason and I, through all the chaos, learned that no darkness could ever dim the light of our shared bond. Thunderstorms had a way of making our house seem like a ship in the midst of a tempest, cozy and isolated from the world. That night was no different, with the storm raging outside. As each of us in the family settled into our corners of comfort, I was in my room, sprawled across my bed with the TV casting flickering shadows against the walls, losing myself in a marathon of old sci-fi classics. Downstairs, laughter bubbled from the living room where my parents were indulging in their favorite comedy series, and the occasional outbursts and cheers from my sister echoed from the attic where she battled virtual foes in her video games. The familiar sound of rain drumming on the roof usually soothed me, blending with the hum of the TV. But that calm was shattered by a sudden, monstrous bang against my window that catapulted me from tranquility into high alert. Heart pounding, I paused the TV and crept towards the window, the hair on my neck standing on end. Peering out, I could just make out a figure through the rain-smeared glass, a shadow that seemed more ominous with each flash of lightning. The figure started pounding on the window, the thuds muffled yet frantic. I could barely make out his shouts, his voice distorted and desperate as he screamed for help. My mind raced as I cracked the window open, just enough to hear him better against the roar of the storm. "Let me in! I'm hurt!" he yelled, his face contorted in pain or anger. I couldn't tell which. The rain was deafening, so I shouted back for him to go around to the front door, then quickly shut the window, my hands shaking. I raced downstairs, skipping steps in my urgency, bursting into the living room where my parents were now muted by the intensity of the situation. "There's a man outside," I gasped, breathless. "He's hurt, or at least he says he is. He's coming to the front." No sooner had I spoken than a series of loud knocks and distressed shouts erupted from the front door, pulling all attention to the impending danger just a few feet away. My dad, always the protector, rose with a mix of concern and caution etched on his face. He moved towards the door, but I grabbed his arm, my instinct screaming that something wasn't right. "Wait," I urged, my voice a mix of fear and pleading. "We don't know who he is." As if on cue, the phone rang, slicing through the tense air with its shrill tone. The caller ID flashed our neighbor's name, Mr. Thompson, across the TV screen. My dad hurried to answer it, the concern in his movements palpable. The brief conversation that followed was punctuated by my dad's disbelief and a chilling, "No fucking way." He hung up the phone with a grave look and turned to us. "Stay away from the door," he commanded, a seriousness in his voice that I'd seldom heard. He moved to peek through the curtains at the man still pounding on our door. From my angle, all I could see was the silhouette of my dad, tense and alert. "There's a guy crouched down out there," Dad whispered, turning back to face us. His voice was low, urgent. "He's holding something looks like a large, sharp tool." He didn't need to say more. My mom pulled my sister and me back, herding us into the kitchen, away from the front of the house. Meanwhile, Dad yelled through the door, his voice firm and commanding. "Go away. The cops are on their way." The next few minutes were a blur of fear and whispered prayers as we listened to the man finally abandon his attempts, and the sound of his retreating footsteps was swallowed by the storm. Dad stayed on the phone with the police, recounting the events as we huddled together, the storm outside no longer the most threatening presence of the night. Later, we learned from Mr. Thompson that he had seen the same man earlier, a disheveled figure rummaging through his shed and emerging with a large chopping axe. The reality of what could have happened had we opened the door sent shivers down my spine. It was only a few days later when we read about the man's arrest in the newspaper, a small comfort after what had felt like a brush with something dire. The rest of that night, none of us could truly settle back into the peace that had blanketed our home before the storm. Even after the police assured us over the phone that they had apprehended the man and that the immediate danger had passed, the echo of his pounding on our door resonated like a persistent drum in our minds. In the dim light of the kitchen, under the steady hum of the refrigerator, my family gathered around the table, our makeshift fortress against the chaos. Mom brewed a strong pot of coffee, the rich aroma mingling oddly with the lingering adrenaline in our system. No one spoke much. We simply sat together, occasionally reaching out to squeeze a hand or share a glance that said more than words could. As dawn crept up, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. The storm finally began to wane. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the wind calmed, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. Dad was the first to break it, his voice a gentle rumble in the quiet of the early morning. I'm Clara, a 31-year-old woman, and what I'm about to share happened 4 years ago, changing the fabric of my reality forever. My small family and I lived in a quaint wooden farmhouse nestled in rural Idaho, far north of Boise. The landscape was sprawling, our nearest neighbors were miles away, and the only lifeline to the outside world was a crackly television that managed to catch a few local channels on a good day. My husband, Tom, worked rotational shifts at a distant mining site in Montana, leaving me and our 5-year-old son, Danny, to hold down the fort. With Tom gone most of the time, our farmhouse felt larger and emptier than it was, with sounds of silence often louder than the whispers of wind brushing against the old wood siding. Our home was modest, with a stubborn charm about it, particularly our bedroom with its lone window that looked out over miles of untamed wilderness. This window, with its aged wooden frame, became the unlikely sentinel of my story. Despite our efforts to seal it shut, a persistent 2-inch gap remained at the bottom, refusing to be mended. One evening, as a thunderstorm brewed in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the fields, I stood ironing in front of the television, half watching reruns of Sex and the City. Danny was already tucked into bed, his gentle snores a comforting backdrop to the solitude of my task. The quiet of the house was soothing, almost meditative, until a sense of unease began to creep up on me, a feeling I initially dismissed as storm jitters. As I finished folding another freshly ironed shirt, I decided to check on Danny before starting on another load of laundry. I walked down the hallway, the floorboards creaking underfoot, echoing through the quiet house. I peeked into the bedroom to see Danny sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling with each breath. But then, my eyes caught movement at the window. The frame was subtly shifting from side to side. My heart pounded against my rib cage as I processed the sight. It was as though someone was fumbling with the window from the outside. Peering closer in disbelief, my worst fears were confirmed. There, in the dim moonlight filtering through the gap, were 2 hands, pale and desperate, trying to pry open the window frame. A scream tore through the silence of the house as instinct took over. I rushed to Danny, scooping him up from the bed with trembling arms. With every ounce of strength I had, I carried him down the hall to the bathroom, the most secure room I could think of. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking violently. Once inside, I pressed my back against the door, clutching Danny close to my chest as I dialed 911 with my free hand. The phone line crackled to life, and I frantically explained the situation between hurried breaths, praying the intruder hadn't followed us into the house. The dispatcher's voice was a calm anchor in the storm of my panic, assuring me that help was on the way. As we waited, hidden in the dim light of the bathroom, every sound seemed magnified, a testament to the terror that the night had brought. Danny, sensing my fear, clung to me, his small body tense. I whispered reassurances, trying to mask my trembling voice, telling him everything was going to be all right, though I was far from convinced of my own words. The distant sirens grew louder, a sound that had never been more welcome. As the red and blue lights pierced through the darkness, illuminating the farmhouse, relief washed over me in an overwhelming wave. But as the officers swept the house and secured the area, the true gravity of what might have been pressed heavily upon me, a haunting realization that this quiet, isolated life came with hidden dangers I had never truly considered. The police officers, after confirming the house was secure, began their investigation in earnest. Their flashlights cut through the shadows, illuminating every corner of our small farmhouse as they looked for any signs of forced entry or disturbance other than the window. I stood in the living room, Danny still in my arms, watching the officers move with a sense of urgency that matched the pounding of my heart. One of the officers, a kind-faced man named Officer Reynolds, approached me after a thorough check of the premises. "Ma'am, it looks like whoever tried to enter didn't stick around after you noticed them," he explained, his voice steady but gentle. "We'll have someone patrol the area throughout the night to ensure your safety." I nodded, my mind still racing with the terrifying possibilities of what could have happened if I hadn't decided to check on Danny at that precise moment. The thought was suffocating, and I struggled to push it away as I thanked the officers. Once the police had left, promising to keep a close watch, the adrenaline that had surged through my veins began to ebb, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. I looked down at Danny, who had finally fallen asleep in my arms, his small features relaxed in slumber. Quietly, I carried him back to his room, not wanting to put him back in my bedroom where the attempt had occurred. Instead, I laid him down in his own little bed, tucking him under his favorite star-patterned blanket. Unable to sleep and unwilling to venture far from Danny, I settled into a chair in his room, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The vulnerability of our situation, living so remotely without quick access to help, became painfully clear. Tom and I had always cherished our peaceful life away from the hustle of the city, but now that peace felt shattered, replaced by a vigilance I knew would linger. The following morning, with the light of day bringing a semblance of normalcy, I called Tom. When I heard his voice, a mixture of relief and fear spilled out in a torrent of words as I recounted the night's events. "Clara, I'm coming home," was all he said after a pause filled with unspoken emotions. His words were a balm, soothing the raw edges of my frayed nerves. Tom arrived late that evening, and the sight of his truck pulling into the driveway was another layer of security restored. We spent hours discussing our options, talking through our feelings of fear and the need for safety. It was clear that things needed to change. Whether it meant enhancing security around the farmhouse or reconsidering our choice to live so isolated, we were united in our decision to ensure such an incident never threatened our family again. In the days that followed, Tom installed new locks and made sure the window was finally sealed shut. We also invested in a more reliable security system, one that would alert us to any intrusion attempts instantly. Despite these changes, the shadow of that night lingered, a reminder of the fragility of our assumed safety. Life eventually found its rhythm again, but the incident left its mark. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. The freedom I once felt watching Danny play outside was now tinged with a watchful anxiety. Yet, through this ordeal, the bonds within our small family grew stronger. We learned the importance of being prepared, of never taking our safety for granted. Growing up, there was nothing more comforting than the soft glow of the living room TV on a late Friday night. Our house, a cozy two-story in the suburbs of Cedar Grove, Wisconsin, always felt especially snug when the harshness of the outside world was kept at bay by the laughter from sitcoms or the adventures in cartoons. That night, my show of choice was Cosmic Rangers, a vibrant splash of color and excitement that could make any 8-year-old forget about bedtime. The volume was cranked high enough to drown out the gentle patter of rain against the windows, a background soundtrack to my solitude as both of my parents were still awake, doing their own things around the house. My mom was probably in her upstairs office, clicking away on her laptop, while my dad likely tinkered in the garage, lost in his weekend project. That was our routine, our normal. As I sat cross-legged, a few feet from the screen, deeply invested in the intergalactic escapades of Captain Laser, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible call. Danny? The voice was unmistakably my mom's, but it sounded muffled, as if it were coming from somewhere far away. What? I shouted back, not taking my eyes off the screen, assuming she'd come down if it was anything important. No response came, and I quickly dismissed it as nothing, maybe just the wind or the house settling, as my dad often explained the random noises that filled our nights. The episode was reaching its climax when I heard my name again, clearer this time. Danny, come here. There was an urgency in the tone that caught my attention and pulled me away from my heroes facing their own crisis. This call was definitely real, and it was definitely my mom's voice, but it wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from the basement. The basement wasn't a place we used much, mainly just for storage and old furniture that Mom couldn't part with. It was always a bit chillier than the rest of the house, a shadowy space that I ventured into only when absolutely necessary. But the voice was insistent, and I felt a mix of duty and nervous curiosity propel me off the couch. I approached the basement door, a seldom used, creaky gateway that always seemed to groan in protest when opened. Mom, I called out again as I flicked the switch next to the door. The usual flood of light that would spill down the stairwell didn't happen. The bulb, it seemed, had chosen tonight to burn out. Swallowing a lump of apprehension, I peered into the darkness that the open door revealed. The air felt cooler, almost as if inviting me into its depths. Mom, are you down there? Still no answer. Gripping the wooden railing, I tentatively stepped onto the first stair, the wood creaking under my weight. With each step, I hoped to hear some sign of my mom, maybe laughing at her forgetfulness and not answering me, or the flick of the switch that would bring the old basement to life. But nothing came. The silence was oppressive, broken only by another call. Danny, I need you. It was louder, and from deeper within the basement's belly. Heart pounding, I paused, squinting into the blackness, trying to make out any shapes or movements in the gloom. It felt as though the air itself was thickening, wrapping around me like a cold embrace. I wanted to go back, to retreat to the safety of the brightly lit living room and my cartoon heroes who never truly faced danger. Not like this. The logical part of my young mind screamed that this made no sense. Why would my mom be down here, in the dark, not answering directly to my calls? Yet, as I stood there, frozen by uncertainty and fear, I heard my name once more, a desperate whisper now. It echoed off the concrete walls, a sound both familiar and utterly alien. That was enough. Terror overtook curiosity as the primary force driving my actions. I spun on my heel and raced back up the stairs, taking them two at a time, propelled by a surge of adrenaline. Bursting through the door into the kitchen, I slammed it shut behind me, leaning against it as if that flimsy barrier could shield me from whatever lay in the darkness below. Just then, my mom appeared at the top of the kitchen stairs, concern etched across her face as she descended rapidly. Danny, what's wrong? Her voice, the real voice, was filled with worry, not the eerie beckoning I had heard below. I blurted out everything, the calls from the basement, her voice asking for help, my fear peaking in a crescendo of confusion and terror. She listened with a frown, her eyes softening as she took in my panicked state. Honey, I was upstairs in my office. I didn't call for you. I didn't even know you were out of the living room." Determined to prove to me there was nothing to fear, and perhaps to reassure herself, she moved to open the basement door. "Stay here, I'll check." Despite her reassurance, my heart continued to race as she disappeared into the stairwell, a flashlight in her hand cutting through the darkness that had so thoroughly unnerved me. As I waited, the familiar sounds of the house returned. The distant hum of the refrigerator, the soft drum of rain against the window, and yet they did nothing to calm my racing heart. When my mom finally returned, her expression was a mix of relief and confusion. "There's nothing there, Danny. No one. It's just as we left it." She suggested it might have been the TV, or maybe I had fallen asleep and dreamed it all. But deep down, I knew what I heard. It was real as the fear that had gripped me. And though she tried to comfort me, suggesting we go back to the living room to watch the end of Cosmic Rangers together, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unexplainable had happened, something that made me wary of the dark, quiet corners of our home from then on. It was late summer, about 5 years ago, that I had one of those experiences that sticks with you, sharp and unnerving. My then-girlfriend Jenna and I were obsessed with this quaint little cottage she owned up north, a cozy retreat from our bustling lives in the city. We used every free weekend to escape to what we considered our sanctuary, nestled deep in the woods, where the stress of daily life seemed to dissipate with each breath of fresh pine-scented air. The drive was always the same, a 2-hour journey from our place in the city, heading straight north. We would leave right after work, eager to swap the concrete jungle for the tranquility of the countryside. The transition from paved roads to the old familiar dirt road marked the final stretch of our trip and the start of our relaxation. The property was split into 3 parts along this dirt road. The first turnoff led to our nearest neighbor's place, Bob and Carol's cottage. They were an older couple who spent most of their time gardening and birdwatching. Further down the road were 2 more properties. Our cottage was at the very end, just past a small fork in the road where another path branched off to lead to the final cottage, often vacant and shrouded in an air of mystery. One particular night stands out in my memory. It was about midnight, and we were at the fork, gathered around a crackling fire. The kind of fire that pops and hisses, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. We were joined by a couple of friends from the city, Mark and Lisa, who wanted to experience our famous weekend getaway. The night was pitch black, the fire providing the only light, casting eerie shadows and illuminating our faces with its warm glow. We were laughing and sharing stories, the kind that seemed funnier with a drink in hand, when the crisp sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel road cut through our mirth like a cold blade. We all turned towards the sound, our laughter silenced, eyes straining in the darkness. Emerging from the shadows was a man, dressed entirely in black pants, a black hoodie drawn up over his head. All I could make out in the dim light was that he was a white male, nothing else distinguishable about him. The sight was startling. We knew Bob and Carol were not expecting visitors, and they were the only neighbors we usually saw. He walked deliberately through our gathering, illuminated briefly by the firelight, his face obscured, his presence silent but heavy. We called out a cautious greeting, which he ignored completely, continuing his march towards Bob and Carol's cottage before disappearing again into the dark. This wasn't a ghost story or some haunted tale, just a real, flesh and blood man. But his presence was so unexpected, so out of place, that it sent shivers down our spines. No one walks around here, especially not at midnight, and certainly not without a greeting. We tried to brush it off, returning to our drinks and forced laughter. But the mood had shifted. The comfort of the fire seemed lesser now, its light less protective. We wrapped up shortly after and decided to head to bed, though sleep was slow to come with the strange visitor's image lingering in my mind. The next morning, I woke up with a headache, more from the interrupted sleep than anything else. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to walk up to Bob and Carol's place. The ground was soft, and I noticed light impressions in the dirt, a set of footprints that confirmed someone had indeed walked up to their cottage. But that was it. No other signs, no clues as to who our visitor was or why he had wandered through our sight without a word. The rest of the weekend passed without incident. We hiked, laughed, and tried to forget the unsettling visit. But on the drive back to the city, the silence of the car gave me too much time to think. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why did he ignore our greetings? It was an anomaly in our otherwise perfect retreat, a mystery that remained unsolved, adding a tinge of darkness to our cherished getaway. And despite never experiencing anything similar in our subsequent visits, the memory of that night lingered, a shadow at the edge of our tranquil escapes. As the road stretched back towards the city, the familiar skyline slowly coming into view, my mind continued to race, replaying the night's eerie visitor over and over. Jenna, driving, seemed lost in her own thoughts, perhaps unsettled by the incident as well. Mark and Lisa dozed in the back, their earlier enthusiasm dimmed by the late hour and the remnants of last night's disturbance. One crisp autumn evening, a month or so after our unsettling encounter, Jenna and I found ourselves back at the cottage. The trees were ablaze with color, the air sharp with the scent of falling leaves. The beauty of the season was undeniable, yet as we unpacked and settled in, the memory of that midnight visitor was ever present, like a shadow just out of sight.